We welcome to the programme Serge Stroobants, the Europe, Middle East and North Africa Director for the Institute for Economics and Peace, which has this morning released its Global Terrorism Index. Thanks very much for being on the programme.
It's always a pleasure.
So good news and bad news in this report out today, because while deaths from terrorism have halved over the last 4 years, the number of countries actually affected from terrorism is growing. The bottom line is that terrorism is killing fewer people. So does this mean, Serge, that the world's terrorists are becoming less powerful?
Well, I think that the effects of several actions, especially in those conflicts in the Middle East and in Eastern Africa, has shown a clear decrease in the effectiveness of the groups active over there. So this is why you see a decrease in the numbers of victims by terrorism. On the other hand, the root causes of radicalization, of extremism, and eventually of terrorism has not really been addressed. And therefore, you see a redistribution of the remaining capacities of organizations such as Al-Qaeda, for example, or especially the Islamic State, that are spreading to more countries, are bringing their ideology to those countries, and are also starting to have effect in more countries than they had before.
Iraq and Somalia have seen the most improvement, thanks, I imagine, to the defeat of the Islamic State group in Iraq in 2017, also US-led airstrikes against al-Shabaab in Somalia. Are these counterinsurgency efforts the reason why these countries are now seeing quite a significant drop in deaths from terrorism?
Yes, exactly. So those attacks, or at least the efforts by the international community and the United States in those countries, have shown that the capacities of al-Shabaab and Islamic State have been reduced over the years, that their combat capacity has been reduced also, and therefore the capacity to create victims through terrorism have been reduced also. That's good for two reasons. One reason, because there is a clear correlation between violent conflict and combat power and victims of terrorism. And for the second thing I would like to say about this has also been the start of a redistribution of the remaining capacities of those organizations in other regions. And therefore, as we have said before, we have seen an emergence of terrorism in more countries than we had in the past years.
And now, for the first time, I believe, since 2003, Iraq is no longer the country in the world most impacted by terrorism. That very dubious honour now goes to Afghanistan, where the Taliban insurgency has now overtaken the Islamic State group to be the world's deadliest terror group. So can you explain to us to what extent the situation in Afghanistan has deteriorated?
Well, when we saw the results of this year's Global Terrorism Index, it was really remarkable to see the situation in Afghanistan, because out of the 4 most deadliest groups in the world, 2, the Taliban and the ISIL chapter in Afghanistan, are only active for almost 100% of their activities, only active in one country, and that is Afghanistan. And we have seen, especially for the Taliban, an increase by 70% of the number of deaths they have produced. When you look at the Taliban, for example, today, they are responsible for 38% of all deaths by terrorism. I think those figures are really mind-blowing.
Right, and you mentioned in terms of terror becoming more widespread, when groups such as the Islamic State are defeated, nevertheless, you have splinter groups that manage to slip through the cracks, don't you? Other groups that are sympathetic to the cause. So I imagine that complicates things.
Yes, exactly. When you look, for example, at this Khorasan chapter of the Islamic State in Afghanistan, you see a clear local recruitment, and you also see a redistribution of certain assets coming from the Middle East and moving towards Afghanistan. You also see a perpetration of the tactics for recruitment, for propaganda, and also in the tactics and the targets that are used in the terrorist attacks. So you clearly see a reinforcement of different capacities throughout the world, with, of course, a large peak in Afghanistan after the defeat of the capacities of the Islamic State in the Middle East. As I said before, those capacities have been tackled, but not the root causes of their movement and the root causes of their ideology.
Right. Terrorism still remains a global security threat, a very dangerous one. Afghanistan is just one of 40 countries where terrorism is gaining ground. What are the other countries? And can you just sort of take us through what sorts of things that terrorism afflicted countries have in common?
Well, I would say when you look at those countries, I think what they have in common is, I would say, firstly, a lack of governance, a lack of, I would say, central power that is able to deal with security issues in those countries. And terrorist groups will always look for those parts of the world or those specific countries in which they can thrive, and they have less chance to be tackled by local intelligence services and local security services. So I think that's what really at the heart of the redistribution and where those terrorist groups will redistribute.
That brings us to far-right terrorism, which is on the rise in Europe, in North America. This is something that is proving particularly challenging for authorities to tackle. Tell us why.
Well, we have seen that in, especially as you have said, Northern America, Western Europe and Oceania, in about 19 countries, the figures for far-right terrorism have exponentially grown in the past years. Over the past 4 years, so from the peak of terrorism in 2014 until today, we have seen an increase by 320% of the numbers of casualties coming out of far-right terrorist activities. So I think what is difficult there is for security services and intelligence services to redistribute their attention to another form of terrorism that was mainstream before that, and this was done Islamist type or Islamist-driven terrorism. So therefore, they are rediscovering a form of terrorism, and even if the figures are still in the amount of casualties are still marginal compared to the overall figures of terrorism, I think it's very important to dedicate the necessary resources to this type of terrorism in the Western world, I would say.
And it is the case that with far-right terrorism, a lot of the perpetrators of this violence don't necessarily belong to any group, do they?
Well, that's a clear difference with other types of terrorism that we are facing today, where there is a clear narrative, there is a clear ideology, there is also a clear propaganda, mostly online also, and a manipulation, I would say, of a lot of information regarding situation in the countries affected. And then you will always find people that recognize themselves in this narrative. And I think that they have to do something to make sure that the ideas they defend and the ideas they stand for can be defended through a terrorist act.
And just looking at the definition of terrorism, when do we know that an attack is actually terrorism and not just the work of somebody who's mentally unstable?
Well, there is, we are in the field of political sciences and international relations, and there is no clear definition of terrorism that is globally accepted. The definition we use is looking at non-state actors using illegal violence to obtain or to attain political, economic, social goals, or any type of goals they would like to attain. So a clear influence on the government. So one could say that what is considered as far-right terrorism could also be considered as a hate crime. What I would like to say is that the ideology that is used to motivate people to commit those attacks has a clear goal, and this clear goal is a political goal. So this is where I make the link between the definition and the actions that we have seen in the past years. And I think there is a clear definition there that you could categorize what happened in the past year. So, for example, March of this year in New Zealand, or what just happened in Germany, in Halle a couple of weeks ago, can be seen as a lone wolf action, but the ideology that has pushed those people to commit those attacks have a clear political goal.
Right. And just lastly, Serge, the cost of terrorism. The global impact, the report tells us, was $33 billion in 2018. So, this does sound like a fair bit of money. But not only is this figure down on the previous year, terrorism actually costs a lot less compared to other forms of violence, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. We produce also other reports, normally in June, the Global Peace Index. And there we also produce the overall cost of violence for a year. And this is close, a little bit more than 14 trillion for 1 year. So if you compare the 33 billion that are now dedicated to terrorism or linked to terrorism, it's of course very small, very marginal compared to other forms of violence. But nevertheless, I would say that terrorism is one crystallization of, or one form of violence next to many others, and therefore we have seen that terrorism is clearly linked also to violent conflict, and that for 95% of all terrorist attacks will occur in a country that is engaged in at least one violent conflict. So that's what we need to look at, and that's what we need to tackle. It's violent conflict and different forms of violence that it produces.
Okay, Serge Stroobants, thanks very much for being on the program.
My pleasure. Thank you.